Hey guys, tonight we begin with the remarkable lives and incredible resilience of medieval peasants. The everyday heroes who, despite the odds, managed to survive some of the coldest and most brutal nights in history. From makeshift insulation tricks to communal sleeping strategies, their story is one of grit, ingenuity, and determination. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're retuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When you think of medieval life, you might imagine jousting knights, grand feasts, and merry fairs. But for the average peasant, winter was less about merriment and more about one thing: how do we not die tonight? It wasn't just a season, it was a yearly test of endurance, like a cruel teacher who didn't believe in second chances. Picture this: you're living in a tiny mud and stick hut, with walls so thin you could probably hear a bird sneeze outside. No insulation, no real windows, just a small hole stuffed with animal skin. And definitely no thermostat wars with your siblings. The indoor temperature hovered just slightly above whatever was going on outside. If it was freezing out there, it was politely, slightly less freezing inside. Nights were the hardest. Darkness swallowed everything. The wind howled like an angry ghost. The fire in the hearth sputtered quietly, doing its best mostly just warming the toes of whoever was closest. If you were sitting on the far side of the room, you might as well have been camping outside. With worse snacks, clothing didn't offer much relief either. Peasants didn't own fur coats or fluffy blankets. You might have a couple of rough wool tunics, maybe a cloak that smelled faintly of goat, and a hopeful idea that layering them would somehow turn you into a human onion. Spoiler, it didn't really help. And forget about snuggling under soft quilts beds, or often just sacks stuffed with hay or straw, maybe with some old rushes tossed in. For bonus comfort, you'd probably have some fleas joining you too. Luxury, thy name is medieval peasant life. But this wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Frostbite, hypothermia, and simply freezing to death were daily threats, especially for children and the elderly. Every morning you woke up breathing was something close to a miracle, perhaps worth celebrating with a slightly less frozen turnip. Surviving a medieval winter wasn't about coziness. It was about piling on everything you owned, huddling with your animals, and praying you didn't wake up with icicles on your eyebrows. And honestly, that was just the beginning. If you think your apartment feels drafty because the window doesn't close properly, medieval peasants would like a word. Their homes weren't just drafty, they were basically very enthusiastic wind tunnels with a roof. Most houses were built with what historians politely call wattle and daub, construction sticks crisscrossed like a basket, smeared with a charming mix of mud, straw, and yes, animal dung. They weren't trying to be gross. Dung was cheap, sticky, and always available. But those walls, no matter how carefully smeared, didn't stand much chance against a proper storm. Cold wind found every crack, every little gap, and happily danced through the one-room homes, making sure you never got too comfortable. Privacy? Not really. Warmth? Barely. Character building? Absolutely. And then there were the roofs. Thatched roofs looked cute from a distance, but months of snow and rain left them sagging, leaking, and occasionally letting in the local wildlife. Nothing says pleasant evening like a squirrel landing in your soup. Windows, if they existed, were laughably tiny and usually covered with thin animal hides or wooden shutters. Glass was a rare luxury. Even the lord of the manor might have only had a single small pane. Peasants were just hoping the wind didn't rip the cowhide right off mid-blizzard. Floors were no better, just compacted dirt. When it rained or snowed heavily, moisture seeped in from below. You could say they had indoor water features, though no one appreciated it. Walking across your own home could feel like crossing a frozen marsh. Cold from below, above, and all around. It was a full-body, three-dimensional attack on your body heat. But peasants didn't complain. They packed moss into cracks, shoved old rags in the worst drafts, and huddled together human insulation at its finest. A little stubbornness, a dash of creativity, and maybe some sheep grease on the walls were all that stood between them and becoming medieval popsicles. Because if your home was falling apart, and your best defense involved mud and goat hair, sometimes you just had to laugh, assuming your teeth weren't chattering too hard. As if all that weren't enough, they also had to deal with a silent enemy creeping up from the floor itself. Floors back then weren't really floors, just slightly flatter patches of ground inside the house. If you were lucky, someone tossed down some straw or rushes for comfort, but don't be fooled. You were still sleeping just inches above the cold, hard earth. And that cold was relentless. It seeped upward like a ghost into your bones and through your soul. Drop something on the floor at night? Congratulations. It's now part of the permafrost. Peasants tried to fight back by layering straw or dried rushes. If you could afford enough or sneak it from a neighbor, you might have some insulation, but it didn't last long. It got moldy, attracted pests, and made crunching noises with every step. Beds weren't much help either. At best, they were wooden frames stuffed with more straw or hay. Not cozy mattresses, just lumpy shifting layers that couldn't stop the cold radiating up from the ground. Tossing and turning wasn't a search for comfort. It was a survival tactic to keep the blood flowing. In the end, medieval peasants didn't beat the cold. They learned to sleep uncomfortably above it. A good night wasn't about dreaming. It was about waking up with all your toes. And if you managed that, you were doing better than most. If medieval homes had a single hero in winter, it wasn't the roof or the walls, or even the moss-stuffed cracks. It was the hearth, a crackling, stubborn fire pit that stood between you and the darkness, the cold, and the endless gloom. At the heart of almost every peasant home was a simple fire. No stone fireplace, no elegant chimney, just a pit or a ring of stones, some half-burnt logs, and a whole lot of smoke. Not ideal if you liked breathing or living long, but effective in its own smoky way. Most homes didn't even have chimneys. Smoke drifted out through small holes in the roof, or cracks in the walls, or directly into your lungs if it felt like staying inside that night. It wasn't great for your lifespan, but it did help with fleas and other pests. Who needs pest control when you're constantly marinating in smoke? The hearth wasn't just about warmth. It was also the kitchen, the light source, and sometimes even the medieval version of a television. Families sat around it telling stories, sharing gossip, or just staring into the flames, because honestly, there wasn't much else to do once the sun went down. Keeping the fire alive wasn't just a nice idea, it was mandatory. Letting the fire die out a tea. Night was like putting up a sign for the cold to come in and finish you off. Plus, reigniting a fire in winter wasn't as easy as striking a match. You had to work with flint, steel, kindling, and more prayers than you'd ever offered before. Everyone in the family had a job tending the flames, watching the embers, adding peat sticks, or if you were lucky, a precious piece of dry wood. It was a constant tug-of-war between human persistence and the smothering cold that wanted nothing more than to snuff you out. The hearth didn't guarantee survival, but without it, survival was nearly impossible. It was smoky, sputtering, and often disappointing, but in a medieval winter, it was the flickering heart of hope. If there was one thing medieval peasants feared more than running out of ale, it was letting the fire go out overnight. That warm, flickering lifeline kept the cold at bay, and once it was gone, the chill would creep in faster than a tax collector after harvest. Restarting a fire in the dead of winter wasn't just inconvenient, it could be deadly. Matches didn't exist. Lighters? Not even in dreams. Rekindling a fire meant striking flint against steel, hoping for a tiny spark, and coaxing it to life with whatever dry bits of kindling you hadn't already used up. All this in the freezing dark, half asleep, with frozen fingers, and sometimes a hungry wolf howling somewhere outside. So peasants got smart. They banked the fire not in a savings account, but by burying the warm embers beneath a soft mound of ash right before bed. The ash worked like a blanket, keeping the coals barely alive until morning. Done properly, you could stroll over at dawn, poke the pile, toss on some wood, and voila, fire without the frostbite. Done wrong? Well, mornings got colder and tempers a lot shorter. Fire banking was an art, passed down like a family recipe. Everyone had their secret. Some swore by dry ash, others by a hint of dampness. Some packed the coals tight, others let them breathe. You could start a heated medieval argument just by claiming your fire banking method was better. It was like barbecue technique, debates accept, with higher survival stakes. Even then, fire banking didn't always work. A sudden gust of wind could sneak in and smother the embers, or a clumsy sheep might stumble through the hearth. Yes, really. That's why some families took turns waking up at night just to check the coals. The medieval version of half-asleep thermostat runs. In the end, it wasn't about mastering nature. It was about buying yourself just a few more precious hours of warmth. And if you woke up to even one glowing ember, that was a small victory, and enough to face another day of battling the cold. In medieval times, the phrase, "the more the merrier," wasn't about parties. It was a winter survival tactic. When the fire weakened and the wind came whistling in, the most reliable source of heat was each other. If that meant sleeping face to face with your entire family, your neighbors, a few livestock, and a very confused goose, so be it. Forget privacy. On the coldest nights, comfort took a back seat to survival. Whole households piled into the warmest corner of the home, wrapped in whatever rags they could find, forming what could only be described as a snoring, steaming human lasagna. Kids wedged between parents, elders tucked along the outer edges, and if Cousin Ethel dropped in unexpectedly, well, there was always room for one more. If you were lucky, you got a spot in the middle, surrounded by radiant body heat. If you weren't, you were on the edge, basically sleeping next to the door of a meat locker. And heaven help the person who moved too much during the night one wrong roll, and Aunt Maud was shivering in the draft against the wall. Congratulations, you were now the family villain. Bedding was communal too. A shared straw mattress that slowly flattened under the weight of multiple generations. And with medieval hygiene not exactly thriving, let's just say the sleeping arrangements were not what you'd call fragrant. But when it came down to you or frostbite, you stopped being picky. Body heat was strategy. Some guides even suggested placing the strongest, warmest folks on the outside like human shields, while babies and frail elders snuggled into the middle like precious little heat generators. It wasn't just about making it through the night. Over time, it became part of life, part of bonding. Families told stories, sang songs, and mumbled their way through long winter nights under shared wool blankets. So next time your sibling steals the covers or your dog hogs the bed, just remember, you're not trying to stay warm between a snoring uncle and a judgmental goat. If you thought modern roommates were tough, medieval peasants would like to introduce you to their winter housemates. Cows, goats, pigs, chickens. Basically anything with a pulse and a bit of warmth. Bringing animals inside wasn't quirky, it was survival. Livestock meant heat, and in homes where the wind howled louder than your stomach, every single degree counted. Plus, if your goat shared a wall with you, it was slightly less likely to get stolen overnight. Two birds, one stinky stone. By nightfall, homes became bustling, mooing, clucking furnaces. Chickens huddled in corners. Pigs snorted near the fire. Cows lounged against the walls, chewing cud like they owned the place. It wasn't elegant, not even close. Imagine being trapped in a car with someone who hadn't bathed for 5 months. And that someone was a cow. That was winter. And there was no escape. The smell? Legendary. By spring, the scent of a shared winter could peel paint. You didn't need scented candles. Your nostrils were already on the wildest ride of their lives. But peasants rarely complained. They understood a hard truth. More animals meant fewer frozen toes. Certain animals even got VIP spots. Cows, being the largest and warmest, lounged closest to the family. Goats got cozy too. They were persistent little creatures and likely invited themselves in anyway. Chickens nested in baskets or rafters. Pigs, they flopped wherever they pleased. Sharing your room with livestock wasn't exactly peaceful. Imagine drifting off, and suddenly a chicken decides your hair is a great place to roost, or stepping into something unpleasant first thing in the morning. Yes, medieval mornings were full of surprises. Still, noise, smells, hooves in the ribs, it was worth it. Peasants knew the math. Cold kills. Cows cuddle, whether they want to or not. In medieval winters, fashion wasn't about looking good. It was about not dying. Peasants weren't keeping up with trends. They were layering up like they were going into battle against winter itself. The rule? If you owned it, you wore it sometimes all at once. You'd start with a scratchy linen undertunic, probably not very clean. Then a thick wool tunic. Maybe another one. Add sagging leggings, a heavy cloak, and if you were really fortunate, a patched sheepskin draped over your shoulders like some kind of frosty trophy. Congrats, you were now about 10% warmer and 90% itchier. Boots were a luxury. Most peasants wrapped their feet in layers of rags and cloth, stuffed them into wooden clogs, and if the cold still crept in, add another rag. Hope for the best. Hope you didn't lose a toe. And forget about washing all those layers. Doing laundry in winter meant dragging your clothes to a frozen stream, breaking through ice, and waiting 2 days for your only shirt to dry if it didn't just freeze into a tragic shirt sculpture first. Most peasants wisely decided that smelling like a mix of smoke, sweat, and sheep was a small price to pay for not turning into a peasant-shaped ice cube. Interestingly, all that dirt and grease buildup had a secret perk: insulation. That grimy layer trapped body heat, turning clothes into a sort of medieval Gore-Tex jacket, just smellier and far less socially acceptable by today's standards. Hats, scarves, and gloves were prized treasures. A simple wool cap could be the line between a normal night and waking up with your hair frozen to the wall. Gloves were often handmade from whatever scraps of leather or cloth could be scrounged, sometimes looking more like sad puppet costumes than anything warm or stylish. Children were bundled up until they resembled overstuffed root vegetables, waddling awkwardly around like little woolen turnips. The goal was simple: trap body heat. Elegance? Never heard of her. Warmth was the real medieval flex. So the next time you complain about layering up for a chilly day, remember, medieval peasants wore nearly their entire wardrobe all at once, looking like walking laundry piles and feeling lucky to have the layers to begin with. In the medieval survival playbook, dirt wasn't something to wash off. It was strategy. In fact, getting grimy wasn't a sign of giving up. It was practical, tactical, and surprisingly clever. Winter came with a specific challenge: heat loss. And unfortunately, clean linen was actually terrible at keeping warmth in. Sure, it was breathable, but in a season where the air hovered between hypothermia. And why is my breath crunchy? Breathable wasn't what you wanted. So peasants stopped washing their clothes. Layers of grime, oil, and plain old mud began to build up on tunics and cloaks, eventually creating a natural wind-blocking barrier. It was medieval weatherproofing, just a bit more fragrant. Yes, you might smell like a goat who lost a bet, but you were warm. Some even believed that washing too often in the cold could make you sick. Better to keep that protective crust right where it was. Bathing was rare. Laundry? Rarer still. And soap was often saved for life's biggest moments, like when a bishop visited, or when you died. Even clothing changes followed this logic. Instead of swapping out dirty clothes, you just added new layers on top of old ones. By February, you were a walking archive of the past 6 weeks, with every stain telling a story like that time you fell in a puddle but didn't freeze. To outsiders, it might have looked like peasants had given up on cleanliness, but to them, every crusty tunic was a heat shield, every mud patch a choice. It wasn't glamorous, but neither was frostbite. Besides, everyone smelled awful, so no one noticed. Nose blindness was part of the lifestyle. So yes, in medieval winter, filth wasn't failure, it was function. And if by February your outer layer crackled when you moved, congratulations, you were winning. If you imagine medieval peasants curled up under feather quilts in cozy beds, you might be disappointed. The truth was far more rustic, more pile of dead plants than bed. Most slept on a rough wooden frame if they were lucky, topped with a sack stuffed full of straw, hay, or rushes. That's it. No mattress. No support. No comfort. Just a crunchy, uneven mess that smelled faintly of barnyard and long-held regret. Every shift in the night brought a crackle of straw and an occasional jab from something pokey. Some didn't even bother with a frame. They just threw the straw on the dirt floor and hoped for the best. These earth-connected beds might sound trendy today, but back then they were born of necessity, not mindfulness. Straw bedding didn't last long. Over time, it flattened, grew moldy, attracted bugs, and turned into a hazard. Changing it was a whole ordeal done, a few times a year, or whenever your bed started moving on its own. Rushes offered a nice alternative, spread thick and often mixed with herbs like lavender to fight off the aroma of barn life. Fresh rushes smelled wonderful briefly. After a day or so, they became part of the muddy, trampled scenery, blending in with dirt, crumbs, and whatever else wandered indoors. Then there were the bedfellows, fleas, lice, and other lovely little companions that adored straw beds. If you woke up scratching more than you slept, congratulations, you had the full medieval sleep experience. Still, these scratchy straw piles were lifesavers. They added a crucial buffer against the freezing dirt floor, and huddling together on them made it possible to share body heat. It wasn't comfort, it was survival, medieval style. So the next time you melt into your soft memory foam mattress, remember somewhere in the afterlife, a medieval peasant is watching you, smiling through a few missing teeth and muttering, "Must be nice." When your home is made of sticks, mud, and determination, winter breezes aren't just annoying, they're downright insulting. Medieval peasants didn't just battle the cold outside, they fought it inside their homes too. Walls bent, mud cracked, roofs sagged. The cold always found a way in, like a frosty prankster with a personal vendetta. So patching up the house became a serious project. Gaps were stuffed with moss, straw, old cloth, dried grass, even tufts of animal hair. If it was soft and slightly squishy, it found its way into a crack. Some went further, slapping extra layers of mud and manure onto the outer walls before winter hit. Imagine standing in the cold, plastering frozen dung onto your house while whispering, "This is fine. This is luxury." Leaks in the roof were another battle. Thatched roofing didn't age well after a few storms. It was like trying to sleep beneath a soggy sponge. Peasants plugged leaks with cloth, bundles of reeds, or, in times of desperation, chunks of turf borrowed from nearby fields. Eventually, every house started to resemble a sad quilt patched together with whatever the owners had left and a prayer. Doors and windows didn't help much either. Most were simple wooden planks hung with iron nails and a lot of hope. Window openings were often covered with hides or fabric soaked in animal fat to block the breeze, adding a bonus whiff of roast mystery meat to your living space. Each night became a duel between peasant ingenuity and relentless cold. One moment you're cozy. The next, a freezing gust slips through a crack and smacks you awake like a frosty slap to the face. And yet, through clever tricks, sheer willpower, and an unwillingness to freeze quietly, peasants managed to patch and seal their homes just enough to make it through, one muddy handful at a time. When the cold kept you from sleeping, medieval peasants had one final strategy. Don't bother pretending everyone's asleep. Instead, they developed a rotation, sleeping in shifts. Not some military operation, no bells or formal orders, just necessity. While half the household curled up beneath tattered blankets and piles of straw, the other half stayed up tending the fire, plugging fresh drafts and checking on the embers. The fire required constant. Left alone, the fire would quietly fade to nothing, and restarting it was about as easy as convincing a stubborn donkey to do ballet. That's why someone always had to be on ember patrol. And since no one wanted to crawl out of their warmish corner once they were settled, families came up with a rotation. You'd get a few hours of precious sleep, then be elbowed awake, gradually shuffle over to the hearth, and do your best to coax the fire back to life, while trying not to trip over a goat or step in something unpleasant. It wasn't glamorous, no cozy slippers, no midnight snacks, no 5 more minutes button. Just creaky knees, heavy eyelids, and quiet annoyance at whoever was snoring while you were working. Even children old enough to hold a stick were drafted into fire duty, learning early that in winter, everyone helped, or everyone froze. Grandparents sometimes stayed up by the fire longer, partly because they had experience, and partly because getting down and back up again was an event best avoided. And when it was your turn to sleep, good luck. Between shifting family members, rustling animals, rattling wind, and the occasional accidental kick from a sibling, rest was more of a concept than a guarantee. Still, the system worked. Someone was always awake, always watching, always ready to poke at the coals with cold hands and sleepy eyes. The fire survived, and so did the people. So next time you sigh about getting up to adjust the thermostat or let the cat out, picture a medieval peasant squinting at flickering coals at 3 a.m., wondering if toes were really all that necessary. You know it's cold when you have to think about how to breathe. In winter, even air could betray you. Deep, open-mouthed breaths pulled freezing air straight into your lungs. And in a world where a cough could become a death sentence, that was a risk no one took lightly. So peasants adapted. They developed a kind of survival breathing. No gasping, no sighing, no mouthfuls of frost. Instead, they kept their breathing shallow, slow, and always through the nose. It helped gently warm the air before it hit their chest. Not perfect, but better than hacking for days. If you accidentally inhaled deeply through your mouth in February, you could expect a week of coughing up pieces of your soul. With no doctors around, treatment usually involved hot onion tea, warm compresses, and a stern prayer from Grandma. Some folks went a step further, tucking a shawl or part of a cloak up over their face at night. It worked like a makeshift breath warmer, though by morning the fabric was damp and stuck to your lips like a sad, soggy scarf. Still, better than freezing from the inside out. Even kids were taught the art of breathing properly. Parents would scold little ones for panting indoors during the cold season. Between nose-only breathing, scratchy wool clothing, and a goat snoring beside your head, medieval childhood winters weren't exactly magical, but they were unforgettable. At night, tucked into straw beds under heaps of cloaks, and beside a gently steaming cow, breathing became an act of quiet survival. Slow, steady, nose only. Almost like meditation. If your yoga instructor was yelling about turnips and your mat smelled like goat, it wasn't the most glamorous strategy. But one breath at a time, it worked. In the long, icy war that was a medieval winter, food wasn't just fuel, it was armor. A full belly meant a fighting chance. The trick was simple. Eat something hearty and heavy before bed, and let your body warm itself from the inside as it digested. Basic medieval thermodynamics. Stews filled with root vegetables like onions, turnips, and parsnips were standard. Grains helped too. Porridge, barley gruel, and thick rye bread. And on special days, feast days or lucky hunting trips, you might even get a slice of dried sausage or a hunk of salted pork. No fancy plating. No delicate seasonings. Just one enormous, vaguely brown bowl of warmth, designed to sit in your stomach like a friendly, heat-generating brick. Fatty foods were especially prized, not just for their calories, but because fat digests slowly, giving off steady warmth all night. A belly full of stew, bread, and mystery meat? That was peak medieval luxury. Parents made sure the kids ate too, even the picky ones. No one cared if little Thomas didn't like parsnips. You ate the parsnips, or you froze thinking about how much you missed them. Of course, a heavy bedtime meal had its downsides. Vivid, strange dreams were common, your stomach doing interpretive dance with turnips and pork fat all night long. But the trade-off was worth it. No one was chasing flavor. They were chasing survival. If that meant going to bed full, bloated, and gently nose-breathing beside a cow, then so be it. That was just how you made it to another sunrise. Before electric blankets and heated mattress pads, warmth had to come from creativity, and that's where hayboxes and hot stones came in. A haybox might sound charming, and it was, in its own scratchy way. Picture a sturdy wooden chest packed tight with hay. After cooking, food was tucked inside to stay warm for hours, kind of like a slow cooker made of grass. Porridge, stew, leftover barley mush, all tucked away and kept edible well past dinner time. No need to restart the fire just to reheat something. But peasants didn't stop there. They realized if hay could hold heat from a stew pot, it could also hold heat from something even better, rocks. Enter the heated stone. Before bed, someone, often a child who lost the evening's argument, would grab a flat rock and shove it deep into the hearth fire. Once it was hot enough to make you nervous, the stone was pulled out with tongs or a stick, wrapped in rags, and tucked into a clay pot or beneath the hay in the bedding. Voila! A makeshift heating pad, radiating precious warmth through the night. Of course, it wasn't foolproof. Forget to wrap it well, and you'd start a miniature house fire. Drop it on your toe? Congratulations, you just invented frostbite with a side of bruising. But when it worked, it was a tiny miracle. The difference between shivering and sleeping. In a peasant's world, luxury wasn't soft pillows or silk sheets. It was waking up with fingers that still moved. And sometimes that came down to nothing more than a rock and some hay. In the heart of every medieval home stood the hearth, smoky, stubborn, sometimes uncooperative, but always essential. It wasn't just for cooking. It was your nightlight, your heat source, and your lifeline. Sleeping arrangements were built around it. The closer you were to the fire, the better your odds of waking up without frost in your hair. Babies, elders, and anyone sick were placed closest. Parents, teens, and hardier bodies fanned out around them, forming a human insulation system. That wasn't just kindness. It was survival logic. Babies were fragile, but radiated warmth. Elders had the wisdom worth protecting. And frankly, they usually had the best gossip. Getting a prime spot by the fire was like winning the medieval lottery. Just don't roll too close, or you might wake up with singed hair and a smoky blanket. Too far from the hearth, and the cold crept in like a ghost. Too close, and you might become part of the firewood. Sleeping beside a medieval hearth was a delicate dance, like camping inside an icebox, only with more goats. You had to stay close enough to soak up the warmth, but not so close that you woke up singed and smelling like overcooked stew. The fire didn't heat evenly. It mostly baked whoever was directly in front of it, leaving everyone else jostling for position in the narrow cone of warmth, like chilly lizards fighting for a sliver of sunlight. If you were lucky enough to fall asleep facing the flames, you'd drift off with one toasty side, and one side frozen so stiff you could knock on it. Animals joined the pile too. A dog might wriggle into the prime spot by the hearth, tail dangerously wagging near open flame. Chickens would sometimes perch on hearthstones, softly clucking into the night like feathery little fire guardians. Every crackle of burning logs, every gentle shift of glowing embers whispered the same quiet truth. You are alive. You are warm for now. And so, surrounded by family and livestock, peasants would doze in uneasy sleep, each breath rising in soft little clouds, fading into the frigid night beyond the fire's fragile circle. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't comfortable. But it was enough. Enough to cling to life, one ember at a time. In the medieval world, no one survived winter alone, unless they wanted to become a very artistic, very frozen statue by January. Winter was not just a family problem. It was a village project. Survival was loud. It was muddy. It smelled like smoke and turnips. And it depended on everyone doing their part. If your neighbor's house fell quiet, you noticed. If smoke stopped curling from Tom's chimney, someone went to check, not just because Tom still owed them a chicken, though that helped, but because his fire was also their concern. Villages had informal winter watchers. The elderly, or the too young to work, kept quiet eyes on things. Who was coughing too much? Who hadn't come to market in a while? Whose windows looked just a little too still under the morning frost? They were the original neighborhood patrol. No reflective vests, but plenty of wool, smoke, and sheep. If someone's fire went out, it was serious. A good neighbor might dash over with a glowing coal wrapped in rags. Or they might simply open their door and make room in their own already cramped, already noisy home. Yes, it meant squeezing a few more shivering bodies into a space already bursting with straw and snoring. But it was better than finding someone frozen come spring. Villages sometimes dipped into communal food stores too. Grain, dried vegetables, a strip of salted meat here and there. No one had extra, but sometimes just one warm meal shared among many made all the difference. Even children helped. They carried firewood, shared embers, and delivered messages in the snow when help was needed. No one was too small or too tired when winter came knocking. Of course, people still had their arguments over land, over goats, over that one cooking pot no one admitted borrowing. But when the wind howled and roofs sagged under ice, even old grudges were quietly set aside. Because the person you argued with yesterday might be the one who saves your life tomorrow. And so, in the dark of winter, villages became families, stubborn, patched-together families, bound not just by blood, but by warmth. Medieval peasants didn't just rely on fire and food to survive the cold. They also leaned hard on faith. When the winds howled like wolves and the fire dimmed to angry embers, they turned to prayer, just for that extra bit of help. Faith wasn't confined to Sundays. It was tucked into every frozen breath. Before crawling under straw and scratchy wool, families would kneel together, whispering hurried prayers for warmth, strength, and the roof not to cave in. Saints became more than distant holy names. Saint Blaise was called on to protect against throat ailments, not a small matter when one breath could become deadly. St. Nicholas wasn't yet the gift-giver we know today. He was asked to shield homes from ruin during winter's leanest months. Superstition wove itself into the nightly routine. Some families sprinkled holy water near the hearth. Others marked doorways with blessed chalk after feast days. Candles were lit and left burning, quiet flickers against the dark, each flame a gentle plea for mercy. And sometimes There were promises. "Dear Lord, if you just get us through this night, I'll be nicer to my neighbor, even the one who keeps stealing turnips." Faith wasn't about comfort. It was about survival. Just a little warmth, a little food, one more sunrise. Sometimes, though, even all the prayers and clever tricks couldn't hold winter back. When winter won, it didn't just take one unlucky soul. It took entire families. Sometimes whole villages disappeared beneath a heavy silence of snow and ice. Winters like the one in 1315, the start of the Great Famine, were brutal. Crops failed, livestock starved, rain ruined the land, and the cold sealed the rest. Stories whispered of people boiling shoe leather, chewing bark, and in the darkest corners. Worse, letting the fire go out wasn't just inconvenient. It could be the end. Sometimes in spring, neighbors would find whole homes still and quiet, bodies huddled together under straw, frozen in their final embrace, as if trying to share one last breath of warmth. Even the homes could give way. A roof heavy with ice might collapse in the night, sudden, fatal, unstoppable. Even reaching out for help wasn't a guarantee. If your neighbors were already stretched thin, there might be no room left, no food, no fire to spare. And disease came with the cold, weakness from hunger, smoke-choked air, close, cramped spaces. A cough in December could be a funeral in January. Frostbite left its mark too, blackened toes, fingers, and ears. Some peasants survived winter, but not in one piece. The horror wasn't just in the dying. It was in how normal it became. Everyone knew some wouldn't make it to spring. And still, they kept going. Because as long as a single ember remained in the hearth, as long as breath still steamed softly in the air, there was something left to fight for. It's easy now to look back at medieval peasants and see only the hardship. The cracked skin, the frozen boots, the soot-covered walls. But buried in that struggle is something powerful. A kind of endurance that doesn't give up. A creativity born from necessity. No central heat, no fleece pajamas. Just stubbornness, grit, and a community built on shared survival. Every hay-stuffed mattress, every moss-packed crack in the wall, every rough-banked fire pit, all of it was a testament. They didn't break. They adapted. They passed down lessons in the flicker of firelight and the hush of shared breath. They taught each other how to survive. And somehow, year after frozen year, they did.